Well, the Old Curiosity Shop comes after Nicholas Nickleby, doesn't it? What Dickens did was he was getting a bit exhausted writing these great novels in 20 monthly parts. He was now hugely successful, and he wanted to, and he persuaded his publishers to found a magazine called Master Humphrey's Clock, a weekly magazine. And the idea was that there should be lots of people contributing stories and articles and so forth to it, and that Dickens himself should be the editor and should also contribute sketches and stories, which he began to do. And it came out in weekly parts. And people, first of all, bought it because they would have bought anything by Dickens's name. And the Old Curiosity and the Old Curiosity Shop. No, it was called Master Humphrey's Clock. That was the name of the magazine. And there was some bizarre idea Dickens had of this club of old gentlemen who met together to read stories to each other, and they'd find the manuscripts of these stories in the works of an old grandfather clock. I mean, it's a kind of rather clumsy allegory of, old stories from time back and so on. So there was a lot of paraphernalia about that, and the public didn't like it really. I mean, they thought Master Humphrey's Clock was going to be a new novel by Dickens, like Nicholas Nickleby. And when they found that it was just a sort of collection of sketches and short stories, the sales began to drop quite alarmingly. And Dickens, who had hoped that he'd get a bit of help, as it were, he'd get other people to write stories and sketches for this weekly magazine, found that he had to write it all himself, and he had to very quickly develop a long novel out of it. It was called, first of all, Personal Adventures of Master Humphrey, but that was just supposed to be a little sketch in which he meets little Nell in the city trying to sell diamonds and so on, and wonders, he's intrigued and goes home with her and finds her old grandfather in the Old Curiosity Shop, and then Quilp comes in and so forth. And Dickens had immediately to expand this into, he had no idea where he was going with it, but it had to take over the whole magazine. So that instead of finding he was writing a novel in monthly parts, he was writing a novel in weekly parts. So it was even more intense pressure. The fantastic performance as Quilp, the little dwarf villain character by Hay Petrie, who turned in a stupendous performance. It's one of those like Alec Guinness's Fagin and Oliver Twist that you just never forget. Really embodies one of Dickens's great grotesque characters. And so I remembered that, and I remembered also the tremendous trouble that clearly Thomas Bentley had taken, as he did with all his Dickens films, to get the exact location, as much as possible, to recreate the original illustrations as settings for the action. Quilp's wharf in the Old Curiosity Shop is memorably illustrated by Catamole in the original weekly parts of the Old Curiosity Shop, and the filmmakers have clearly gone to enormous trouble to reproduce it, and to reproduce the church that Nell ends up in as sort of caretaker, and the adjoining kind of chantry chapel that she seems to live in with her old grandfather. And these are exactly done as in the Catamole illustrations. One of the many interesting things about the film of the Old Curiosity Shop was how on earth to make it into a coherent narrative, because, as I've said, it developed accidentally, even more accidentally than Nicholas Nickleby. It was very much a hand-to-mouth business on Dickens's part. And the mystery of who the strange gentleman is, and who the relationships of all the different characters to each other, Dickens works out as he goes along, and it isn't until the grand finale that he pulls it all together. Thomas Bentley very sensibly started the film with a little scene made-up scene that explained that the single gentleman was indeed little Nell's, oh gosh, what was he now? I've even forgotten. Something very complicated. He was the rejected suitor of little Nell's mother, who was dead before the story starts. So I think that's how it works. No, I think he was the brother of little Nell's grandfather. I mean, Dickens works all this out in the last reels, as it were, of writing the story. He has to kind of make it all tie up. And this mysterious single gentleman who's been chasing after Nell all through the story, trying to find her, to help her, to do her good and so on. Well, she and her grandfather are on the run from the wicked Quilp. And it's a question of which one gets to her first, you know. And so there's all that excitement in the story. But you have no idea who this single gentleman is until Dickens kind of madly works it all out in the last episode. Whereas in the film, Bentley starts with a scene explaining who he is. And so you know why he's looking for Nell. And that makes it a much more coherent story. Thomas Bentley is a very interesting character. He was a performer of Dickens on the music halls. I mean, he did Dickens characters like Bransby Williams, but he was extremely interested in the coming new art of cinematography, as it was called, and he did produce a number of Dickens silent films. The one we'd all love to see is Barnaby Rudge, which had a cast of hundreds and hundreds of extras, because in Barnaby Rudge you have to have a tremendous riot and the burning down of Newgate Prison in 1780 and so on. And apparently this was done quite spectacularly, but unfortunately the print is lost. So that was a silent film. He also made a silent film of The Old Curiosity Shop. But by the 1930s, of course, he'd moved on to talkies. But he was a great favourite with Dickensians. He was very much approved of because he took such enormous care to get the settings right, to make them look as like the original illustrations as possible, to make the actors and actresses look as like the Dickens illustrations as possible. And he gets very highly praised in the Dickensian magazine for Dickens lovers, as it was called. And he gets very highly praised in 1935 by the editor, Walter Dexter. He says, "The film is undoubtedly a faithful and complete representation of the story and the well-known and almost immortal characters. It's almost photographic in its exactness, in its reproduction of Cattermole's drawings." So he's full of praise for it. Mr. Hay Petrie shows us the devilish humour of this misconceived little ruffian with his antics and grimaces, which is quite true. It's amazing how this actor makes himself look like a kind of deformed small dwarf, leaping on and off chairs and appearing at odd moments and so on. The only criticism they find, and this is interesting because it's 1935, is that little Nell is a bit too refined. And she does speak in a very beautiful accent, but then all young ladies in films had to speak like that, you see, at the time. So even for the Dickensians, that was a bit too much. And even later in the Cavalcanti film, of course, the heroines, Kate Nickleby and Madeline Bray, also speak very beautifully. If they were sort of comic old hag figures like Mrs. Squeers in Nicholas Nickleby, Sybil Thorndike could, talk very vulgar, "How's my squeery?" and that sort of thing. But if they were nice young ladies and heroines, they had to speak like that. And of course also the heroes, Nicholas Nickleby himself and so on, all had to speak very received pronunciation. And it's interesting that even in 1935, the speech of little Nell, very educated and refined, was felt to be not quite right.